October 25, 1944. 6:45 a.m. The Philippine Sea. The sun was just breaking over the horizon, painting the Pacific in shades of pink and gray. On the bridge of the USS Fanshawe Bay, a small escort carrier, a lookout raised his binoculars. He was expecting to see nothing but empty ocean. Maybe a few American planes returning from patrol. Instead, he saw a nightmare. Rising out of the mist were the pagodas. The distinctive, towering, pagoda-style superstructures of Japanese battleships. And not just any battleships. Leading the formation was the Yamato. It was the largest, heaviest, and most heavily armed warship in human history. It displaced 72,000 tons. Its main guns were 18.1 inches, firing shells that weighed as much as a car. It was a floating mountain of steel. Behind the Yamato came 3 other battleships, 6 heavy cruisers, 2 light cruisers, and 11 destroyers. It was the Japanese center force, the main striking arm of the Imperial Navy. The American lookout dropped his binoculars and grabbed the phone. Jap fleet. Bearing 340. Range 20 miles. On the bridge, Rear Admiral Clifton, Ziggy, Sprague looked at the report. He thought the lookout was hallucinating. There were supposed to be no Japanese ships within 500 miles. But then, the horizon lit up. Flashes of light, like distant lightning. 30 seconds later, the sound arrived, a deep, rolling thunder. And then, the water around the tiny American ships erupted in geysers of white spray that towered hundreds of feet into the air. The Japanese were firing. And they weren't missing. Admiral Sprague looked at his own fleet. Taffy 3. He didn't have battleships. He didn't have heavy cruisers. He had 6 escort carriers, CVEs. They were built on merchant hulls. They had no armor. Their top speed was 18 knots, slower than a surface submarine. They carried a handful of planes armed with depth charges and anti-personnel bombs. Defending them were 3 destroyers and 4 tiny destroyer escorts, ships so small they were called tin cans. Sprague did the math instantly. The Japanese fleet could steam at 30 knots. He could do 17. They had guns that could kill him from 20 miles away. His biggest gun was a 5-inch popgun that couldn't dent a cruiser at 5 miles. He was trapped. On the bridge of the Yamato, Admiral Takeo Kurita looked through his high-powered optics. He saw the American carriers. He saw the tiny destroyers. He laughed. He thought he had caught the main American fleet napping. He didn't realize these were escort carriers. He thought they were the big Essex-class fleet carriers. He thought the destroyers were cruisers. He ordered a general attack. No formation. Just charge. Annihilate them. To the Japanese officers, this was the moment they had been waiting for. The decisive battle. They expected the Americans to run. They expected them to scatter like sheep. They expected a massacre. But then, something impossible happened. The tiny American destroyers didn't run away. They turned toward the Japanese fleet. They throttled their engines to flank speed and charged straight into the teeth of the largest guns ever put to sea. And the slow, toy carriers didn't just die. What followed was the greatest last stand in the history of naval warfare. A battle where tin cans fought battleships. Where pilots attacked cruisers with no ammunition. Where a group of expendable ships broke the back of the Imperial Japanese Navy. The Japanese admirals laughed at the toy carriers. By noon, they would be running for their lives. This is forgotten thunder. To understand the miracle of Taffy 3, you have to understand the ships they were sailing. The escort carrier, CV, was the ugly duckling of the U.S. Navy. In 1941, the Navy needed aircraft carriers desperately. But fleet carriers, the big, fast Essex class, took 2 years to build. They needed a stopgap. President Roosevelt proposed a radical idea. Take a merchant ship hull, a freighter meant to carry bananas or coal, and slap a flight deck on top of it. The admirals hated it. It's too slow, they said. It's too small. It has no armor. 1 torpedo will break it in half. But Henry Kaiser, the industrialist who was building Liberty ships in 4 days, said he could build them. And he could build them fast. He was right. Kaiser's shipyards began churning out the Casablanca-class escort carriers. They were mass-produced like cars. They were small, just 500 feet long. They were light, under 8,000 tons. And they were cheap. You could build 20 CVEs for the cost of one Enterprise. But to the sailors who served on them, they were terrifying. They had zero armor. The hull was made of mild steel, the same grade used for washing machines. A .50 caliber machine gun could punch right through the side. The flight deck was wood. The avgas lines ran through the crew quarters. The magazines were unprotected. The crews gave this CV designation a new meaning. Officially, it stood for Carrier Vessel Escort. The sailors said it stood for combustible, vulnerable, expendable. They called them Kaiser coffins. They called them Woolworth carriers, cheap, 5-dime warships. But they were useful. They were used to hunt U-boats in the Atlantic and to support island invasions in the Pacific. Their job was to ferry planes and bomb beaches. Their standing orders were very specific. If you encounter an enemy surface fleet, run. On October 25, 1944, off the coast of Samar in the Philippines, they couldn't run. The setup for the disaster was a masterstroke of Japanese deception. The U.S. Navy was invading Leyte. To protect the landing ships, Admiral Halsey took the main Third Fleet north to chase a decoy force of Japanese carriers. He took all the fast battleships. He took all the heavy carriers. He left the landing beaches, and Taffy 3, completely unguarded. Admiral Kurita slipped his massive center force through the San Bernardino Strait in the middle of the night, undetected. When he emerged at dawn, there was nothing between him and the thousands of helpless American troop transports anchored in Leyte Gulf, except Taffy 3. Admiral Sprague, commanding Taffy 3, looked at the situation. He had 6 baby carriers: Fanshawe Bay, St. Lo, White Plains, Kalinan Bay, Kitkun Bay, and Gamber Bay. He knew his ships were doomed. It was like being a puppy in a cage with a tiger, one sailor recalled. You can bark, but you know how it ends. Sprague got on the radio. He called for help in plain English, screaming that he was under fire from battleships. The heavy U.S. fleet was 300 miles away. Help wasn't coming. Sprague ordered his carriers to turn east, into the wind, to launch aircraft. And he ordered his destroyers to make smoke. "Small boys," he radioed. "Make smoke. Attack." It was a suicide order. And the small boys knew it. Commander Ernest Evans was the captain of the destroyer USS Johnston. Evans was a Cherokee Indian from Oklahoma. He was a brawler, a man who didn't know the meaning of fear. When he took command of the Johnston, he told his crew, "This is a fighting ship. I intend to go in harm's way, and anyone who doesn't want to go along had better get off right now." Nobody got off. When the Japanese fleet appeared, Evans didn't wait for orders. He saw the geysers of water erupting around the carriers. He saw the battleships closing in. He knew that if the Japanese weren't distracted, the carriers would be sunk in 10 minutes. He turned to his helmsman. "Left full rudder. All engines ahead flank." The Johnston turned alone toward the Japanese fleet. Imagine the scene. One destroyer, 2,000 tons, charging a fleet of 4 battleships, 8 cruisers, and 11 destroyers totaling over 200,000 tons. It was David versus Goliath, but Goliath had brought his whole family. As the Johnston raced through the smoke, dodging 14-inch and 18-inch shells that sounded like freight trains passing overhead, Evans ordered the torpedoes readied. The Johnston had 10 torpedoes. To use them, she had to get within 10,000 yards. That meant running a gauntlet of fire for 5 miles. Evans zigzagged the ship. He chased the splashes, steering toward where the last shell hit, gambling that the Japanese gunners would correct their aim and miss the next one. At 10,000 yards, Evans gave the order, "Fire fish!" 10 torpedoes hissed into the water. The Johnston whipped around and retreated into its own smoke. Minutes later, a massive underwater explosion rocked the Japanese heavy cruiser Kumano. The torpedo had blown her bow off. The cruiser, flagship of the Japanese cruiser division, stopped dead in the water. Another cruiser, the Suzuya, had to stop to avoid hitting her. One destroyer had just taken 2 heavy cruisers out of the fight. But the Japanese were angry now. They focused their fire on the Johnston. 3 14-inch shells from the battleship Congo slammed into the destroyer. Then 3 6-inch shells hit the bridge. The damage was catastrophic. The engine room was wrecked. Speed dropped to 17 knots. The steering gear was severed. The bridge was demolished. Commander Evans lost 2 fingers on his left hand and had shrapnel in his chest. He should have abandoned ship. The Johnston was a wreck. Instead, Evans ran to the aft steering station. He steered the ship by shouting orders down a hatch to men manually cranking the rudder. "We're not done yet," he yelled. He turned the crippled Johnston back into the fight. He didn't have torpedoes left. He only had his 5-inch guns. He began to duel with Japanese destroyers, firing furiously to draw attention away from the carriers. Inspired by Evans, the other, small boys, joined the suicide charge. The USS Hull and the USS Herman launched their attacks. The Herman, commanded by Amos Hathaway, charged the heavy cruiser Chikuma. Then, incredibly, it found itself facing the Yamato itself. The tiny destroyer was so close to the massive battleship that the Japanese gunners couldn't depress their guns low enough to hit her. The 18-inch shells whistled harmlessly over the Herman's mast, while the Herman raked the Yamato's bridge with 5-inch machine gun fire. It was insanity. A mosquito attacking an elephant. But it worked. Admiral Kurita, on the Yamato, was forced to turn his battleship away to avoid the American torpedoes. The largest ship in the world was running from a tin can. While the destroyers were dying to buy time, the baby carriers were running for their lives. Admiral Sprague ordered them into a rain squall. For 15 minutes, the mist hid them from the Japanese gunners. Inside the squall, it was organized chaos. "Launch everything," Sprague ordered. The crews on the flight deck scrambled. They didn't have time to brief the pilots. They didn't have time to load the right weapons. Pilots climbed into their TBM Avengers and DFM 2 Wildcats. "What's the load?" a pilot asked his crew chief. "Depth charges." "We didn't have time to switch to torpedoes." "Fine. I'll drop them on their decks." Pilots took off with depth charges meant for submarines. They took off with anti-personnel fragmentation bombs meant for infantry. Some took off with no ammo at all. They formed a swarm of angry bees. Lieutenant Commander Robert Isley led his squadron from the USS Gambier Bay. They flew straight down the throats of the Japanese cruisers. The Japanese had never seen anything like it. American planes were buzzing their bridges. They were dropping depth charges that bounced off the turrets. Pilots were strafing the battleships with .50 caliber machine guns, shattering the searchlights and killing the crews on the anti-aircraft guns. The pilots without ammo made dummy runs. They would dive on a Japanese ship, pretending to release a torpedo. The Japanese captain would panic and turn the ship to comb the track of a torpedo that didn't exist. Every time a Japanese ship turned, it lost speed. It lost ground. The toy carriers were slowing down the giants. One pilot, Lieutenant Paul Garrison, flew inverted over the bridge of a cruiser, firing his revolver out the window. It was pure psychological warfare. But the Japanese kept coming. At 8 o'clock, the rain squall dissipated. The carriers were exposed again. The Japanese cruisers Chikuma, Tone, Haguro, and Chokai closed the range. They began to pound the carriers with 8-inch shells. This is where the Kaiser coffin, nickname, turned into a miracle. The Japanese were firing armor-piercing AP shells. These shells were designed to punch through 10 inches of hardened steel on a battleship before exploding inside. But the CVEs had skin so thin, just half an inch, that the Japanese shells punched right through them without slowing down. They went in one side, passed through the hangar deck, and went out the other side without exploding. Sailors watched 8-inch shells zip through the mess hall like oversized bullets. If the ships had been armored, the shells would have detonated and destroyed them. Their weakness was their survival. Admiral Sprague later said, "We were too thin to fuse them." The carriers fought back with the only gun they had. A single 5-inch gun mounted on the stern, affectionately called the Stinger. It was meant for shooting at surface submarines. The gun crews on the carriers began firing at the Japanese cruisers chasing them. They fired until the paint peeled off the barrels. The USS White Plains achieved the impossible. Her gun crew fired a shell that hit the torpedo launcher on the cruiser Chokai. The Japanese torpedoes exploded. The cruiser's engine and rudder were knocked out. A merchant ship had just crippled a heavy cruiser. But luck runs out. The USS Gambier Bay was the slowest ship in the formation. She fell behind. 3 Japanese cruisers zeroed in on her. They closed to point-blank range, less than 2,000 yards. The Gambier Bay took a hit to the engine room. She lost power. She drifted to a halt. It was a public execution. The Japanese ships pumped shell after shell into the burning carrier. The flight deck was torn apart. Fires raged in the hangar. But the Gambier Bay refused to strike her colors. Her single 5-inch gun kept firing until the water washed over the mount. As the ship capsized and sank, the sailors jumped into the oil-slicked water. They watched their home disappear. They thought they were all going to die. The Japanese fleet was closing in on the rest of the group. The St. Lo was hit. The Kalinin Bay took 15 hits. It was 9 a.m. The Americans had nothing left. No torpedoes. No smoke. No destroyers. Admiral Sprague stood on the bridge of the Fanshawe Bay, expecting the final blow. And then the miracle happened. 9:11 a.m. Admiral Kurita stood on the bridge of the Yamato. He was tired. He had been awake for 48 hours. He looked at the battle. From his perspective, it was a disaster. His fleet was scattered. The smoke screens made it impossible to see. He had lost 2 heavy cruisers to air attacks. A third was crippled by a destroyer torpedo. His own battleship had been forced to run away from a destroyer. Japanese naval doctrine stated that you only encounter such ferocity when fighting the main enemy fleet. Kurita convinced himself that he wasn't fighting escort carriers. He believed he was fighting the main American task force. He thought the tin cans were heavy cruisers. He thought the baby carriers were Enterprise-class fleet carriers. And he was terrified of American airstrikes. He believed that at any moment, hundreds of bombers from Halsey's fleet would appear and sink him. He blinked. Kurita gave the order, "All ships turn north. Disengage." On the bridge of the Fanshawe Bay, a signalman yelled, "Goddamn it, boys, they're getting away." Admiral Sprague couldn't believe his eyes. The Japanese heavy cruisers, which were just minutes away from bringing their main batteries to bear and wiping out Taffy 3, turned their rudders and steamed away. The Japanese fleet, the most powerful surface force ever assembled by the Imperial Navy, had been turned back. Not by battleships. Not by heavy carriers. But by a handful of banana boats and tin cans. The battle was over, but the dying wasn't. As the Japanese fleet retreated, a new horror arrived. The kamikaze. The first organized kamikaze attack of the war struck Taffy 3 just an hour after the surface battle ended. A Zero fighter, carrying a bomb, crashed deliberately into the flight deck of the USS St. Lo. The carrier that had survived the Yamato's guns could not survive the suicide attack. Her magazines detonated. She sank in 30 minutes. But the victory was secured. The landing beaches at Leyte were safe. General MacArthur returned to the Philippines. The cost was high. Taffy 3 lost 2 escort carriers, Gambier Bay, St. Lo, 2 destroyers, Johnston Hull, and a destroyer escort, Samuel B. Roberts. Over 1,000 American sailors died. But they had inflicted greater losses on a superior enemy. They had sunk 3 heavy cruisers and disabled 3 others. More importantly, they had earned the enemy's respect. As the destroyer USS Johnston sank, Japanese sailors on the destroyer Yukikes were seen gathering on the deck. They didn't cheer. They didn't fire at the survivors in the water. The Japanese captain stood at the rail and saluted the sinking American ship. Years later, Admiral Kurita was interviewed. He admitted he was deceived. "We did not know they were escort carriers," a Japanese staff officer said. "They fought like battleships. We assumed they were battleships." The escort carrier was a temporary weapon. After the war, most of them were immediately scrapped. They were razor blades and Toyotas within a decade. But at the Battle off Samar, the combustible, vulnerable, expendable ships proved that armor is not made of steel. It is made of spirit. The crews of Taffy 3, The reservists, the draftees, the kids who learned to sail on the job, stood toe-to-toe with the samurai naval tradition, and they didn't blink. They proved that you don't need the biggest gun to win a fight. You just need the will to stand your ground when the giants come calling. The Japanese laughed at the baby carriers. They called them jokes. But on that morning in October 1944, the joke was on them. This is forgotten thunder. The weapons they laughed at. The stories they forgot.